Hey there. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate the workflow I use to move Gaia 2.0 data into Blender to create these large-scale terrains with complex biomes, grass, trees, rocks, that kind of stuff. All right, so let's get into it. Here we are in the Gaia 2.0 interface. Some changes from previous version of Gaia. I'm not going to talk about me creating these textures too much, the terrain too much, because that's not really the focus of the tutorial. It's more how to get the stuff into Blender. But I am going to click through the nodes, and then you can look at the node that I use, and then you could look at my settings if you wanted to recreate stuff. So I'm starting with a Perline and a Canyon, and then I put them through a combine node to mix them up, add a fold in, add some detail, kind of warp it a little bit with a warp, add an erosion. Those are my settings for erosion. Add some rivers. And then run the river output into an FX node, which gives me this guy. If we look at that in 2D, you can see what that looks like. It gives me a nice kind of delineation between the ground and the river. And then I can take the output from this and run it into some other nodes to create some masks for my trees. So I've got my FX river mask going into my tree node. Actually, let me back up. I've got the output of my rivers node going into a displacement node. And this is the node that's going to be output to Blender as like a TIFF or an EXR file that's going to use to actually displace the topology in Blender. That's going to be a grayscale map. And you can see here that I have an output portal. I created a portal. And portals are just ways to kind of like a go-to statement in old coding where you don't have to have a line that travels to all your nodes. You can create a portal, and then you can just reference that portal, and it just makes it easier. It makes your screen look a lot less spaghetti-like. So two ways to create a portal. You can right-click and go to Manage Portals, and it's going to give you an option to choose which of the node inputs or outputs you want to create a portal for. So I'm going to do the input one, and I'm going to choose displacement, and that's going to go there. Or I could just hit P for portal, and then maybe choose the output one, and it's going to put an output one there. So anywhere you see these kind of bigger tags, out, displacement, those are just portals, and that just means it's a virtual link to another node somewhere. So here's my displacement node. I've created an output portal for it, which is going to be used for a bunch of nodes over here on the right that we'll talk about in a second. But in the meantime, I've got my river FX node that then I use for input into the trees nodes. It used to be arboreal. Now it's called trees. I've got two of them, one's for bushes and one's for trees. So look at this one. You can see my settings here. You can see this is kind of, I've got it set up so that the plants pretty much congregate near water and in valleys, kind of like what I would think bushes might do. And then I run the trees output for that into what's called a halftone node. And that gives me this nice black and white node that I can then export into Blender as a mask. And that is under Output, Render, Halftone. Is where you get that. And you notice here that I did add a couple of functions. I did blur it a little bit, and I equalized it. So I've just taken that halftone mask and added a little bit of function, added two functions to it, just to kind of soften things up. And I did the same thing with my trees. You can see here my tree settings, and the trees are the tree distribution is different than the bush distribution. It's going to allow me to put two different biomes kind of in logical places on my Blender terrain, and then I have a halftone mask for that as well, with a couple of functions on it. So let's go over here, and then these are all the nodes that I export to Blender. To create masks for various characteristics and attributes of my terrain. So here I've got an AO mask. It's kind of a neat mask. It gives you all kinds of little details. You can either use this for distributing different textures for like moss or grass or rocks. You can also use it kind of like a typical AO node where you use it to enhance the shadows, create some artificially enhanced shadows to give it some kick. I have a slope node. Just notice here that all of these nodes use the displacement node from here. So this displacement output node is this portal on all these. That's what that shows up there. All right, so got my slope node. This is going to let you kind of highlight or blend more vertical surfaces with others. You can see my settings here. You can blend the range of it and how smooth or sharp the transition is. There's a height node that's going to let you kind of differentiate between stuff that's low and high. You could use a mask like this for creating vegetation that might be at the bottom of a valley, but then as things get higher up, the vegetation tends to burn out. There's the texture base node, which you can use in Gaia to create kind of neat satellite textures. But I'm just going to export this as a grayscale map to Blender to help me decide where to put some of my vegetation and ground cover. I have a normals map. I use this in conjunction with the displacement. So the displacement node is going to create the overall kind of like macro texture of the terrain, the big hills, the big valleys, that kind of stuff. But you need to have a certain amount of certain number of polygons in order to make a high-res version of your terrain. The normals map then lets you add kind of like micro textures on top of your base thing without having to go crazy with the number of subdivisions or faces on your terrain. I have a debris node that kind of lets me figure out where maybe rocks would go or some other bumps, and then I of course put that into another halftone node with a blur and equalize on it. Just if I wanted to scatter stuff around. I may or may not use all of these, but these are ones that I found to be useful. There's a soil one. This is going to kind of show where dirt might congregate as water flows over it. We have a snow one. Settings for this, you can have more or less snow, high or low snow, all kinds of snow settings. And then I use a halftone node on that just to create my mask for Blender, which will tell me where to put the snow materials. This is the rock mask, the weathering mask, or weathering node rather. It's kind of like Blender's pointiness function. It's going to give you the kind of like the highlight edges of stone. So if you wanted places where you wanted rock to be protruding out of soil, you could use this. And then there's a dirt flow, which is a really nice kind of subtle grayscale map that you can use for distributing ground cover, moss, grass, dirt, that kind of stuff. You might have noticed that all of these have little save symbols next to them, and that's because they're part of the build. So you can, if you click on one of these, you can say mark for export, or just hit F3, and that'll put this little icon here, and that means you want to output that as part of your build. You can see here that I've got all of these files here as part of my build. Scroll up a little bit. And most of the time, JPEG is just fine for these. And you also notice I've also renamed some of these. So like, for example, the halftones, I put snow halftone, and to rename something, just hit F2, and then you can just type in a new name. And that just makes it a little bit easier over here, because you know what you're talking about. As opposed to having halftone, halftone, halftone nodes over here. I know it's the snow halftone, or the tree mass halftone. Okay, anyway, so we've got mostly JPEGs. The normals, I think, needs a little bit more resolution than a JPEG, so I put that as a PNG. The displacement node, this is the one that's going to be used as a displacement modifier on the actual mesh. So high quality there is important, so either a TIFF or an EXR works. And I think everything else is just fine as a JPEG, because these are just like black and white or grayscale masks. And it doesn't really matter if they're a little pixelated, because it's not going to really show up in Blender, but it will save you some space, because the EXR file is going to be significantly bigger than the JPEG. And if you want to save some money, some memory, the JPEGs are going to do it. Okay, and then the last thing to do is to go to Edit, not go to Edit, go to Project rather, and hit Build and Export. You may want to hit your build settings beforehand, and then you can set out your resolution, where you want the files to go when you build them. I haven't ever used these before, but most important setting here is, I think, where you want the files to go and how big you want the files to be. And then we just execute the build. You're going to get this little pop-up, and you hit Start Build, and it's off to the races. Let it run. All right, here we are in Blender. I've got a plane that's going to be our terrain. I've got it scaled to 500 by 500 meters, and I've applied rotation and scale to it. I think in general you want to work with a full-size terrain. It just makes lighting and cameras and fog and volumetrics and other accessories work better if you start off with a full-size plane. It is subdivided quite a bit. I've got 163 faces on here, and I also have a subdivision modifier on here that'll let us have some more details for the displacement modifier. And I do have a mirror on here that just lets me kind of extend it off into the distance. Don't really need to worry about that right now. The displacement modifier uses the EXR that was generated in Gaia. It's this nice grayscale image. It's kind of like a DEM, a digital elevation map, that is going to be used to create the actual macro terrain features. Let me turn that on. See what that looks like. Important thing is, use UV coordinates. The strength is going to let you change, how vertical, how much force is used in displacing. I would recommend keeping it to be something similar to what you saw in Gaia. Otherwise, you're going to get some odd stretching in your vertical surfaces. So we can talk about texturing now. I want to make sure that I give credit where credit is due. I use techniques by two other people for some of my texturing. So this website by Arendelle is a demonstration on how to use Voronoi noise patterns to blend textures together so you don't get repeating patterns. He uses Voronoi and some math functions to make sure you break up the patterns. Really good tutorial. And this one here by King GFX shows how to use the distance from the camera to change the scale of your texture. So you can use the same texture at different distances, but scaled to different sizes. So you get like micro details here, kind of mid-level details here, and then macro details in the distance, all based on distance from camera. It's really a nice way of using your one texture over a large distance and making it look realistic. And these links are down below in the description. Let's take a look at my material here. So here's the highest level of the material. Any of these magenta files or magenta icons are the output from Gaia. I just color them that way so they're easy to find. And then these kind of groups here are a general material. So this is water, this is rock here, this is dirt, and these are grasses and mosses, these green ones. And then they're combined together. The grasses are combined using a mask from Gaia to create kind of a complex grassy texture. The rocks and dirt are combined together using a mask from Gaia to create a kind of rocky dirt texture. And then the overall kind of complex grass texture is then again merged or combined with the rocks and dirts using another mask from Gaia. And that's what kind of the overall structure. And then at the very end, I take the river mask, which is this guy, looks like this, and then superimpose that on top of the whole terrain to add the river on top. So let's kind of drill down into one of these and see what's going on. So here I've got, let me go to the camera view, and let's take a look at, so you can see I've got these two, I got Moss 1 and Moss 2. Let's dive down a little further into this. So now I'm inside that Moss group and kind of looking at a 20,000 foot view. I've got my near, middle, and far, which is from this guy's tutorial, King GFX. At least that's the concept. You can see I've got this value here, this 22 value in this case, going into my nature moss group node, and I'll take a look at that in a second. But you can see how that scale goes into here, and that's going to define the scale of the texture kind of in the bottom here. And then that same value goes into a divide node, which then kind of creates the middle scale for the texture, and then that gets put up into here, into the far node, which is going to define the size of this texture that when it's far away from the camera. Now your numbers may differ. The 3 may work for you, it may not. It kind of depends on how big your scene is and how far your camera is clipping. And this divide value also, you may need to fiddle with this. Let me show you what that looks like. Let's turn on render. And let's go, we're just going to look at this MOS2 output here. So I'm drilling down into that MOS2 output, and you can see that I've got this ray length value going into divide node, going into a color ramp, and what that does is going to break down based on the distance from the camera where this middle texture is going to be. And then this one does the same thing for the far texture. You can see I got this kind of walking gradient, and then they're all combined together, and I get a texture that kind of makes sense at a distance, but when it's getting closer, you got some nice details in it. So let's drill down to the lowest level, and this is where I actually define the texture. You can see I've got the normal, diffuse, roughness, normal, and bump textures here. These are all from downloads that I found in various places, kind of like this. They're all over the place. I would recommend creating kind of a small library of dirt, grass, rocks, moss, snow, any kind of ground cover you might be interested in putting your terrain. Kind of create your own little library of these textures. This node here is the remove seams node from Arendale's tutorial. I didn't quite go as far as he did with his node. So here's my node setup. I'm going to kind of zoom in. If you wanted to copy it, hopefully it's big enough for you to see. I'm going to drag over here. And so that's my setup for that. Basically allows me to blur edges, distort edges, and then there's a scale input, which is this value here, which is going to define how big or small the texture is based on its distance. So going back in here, for grassy textures, mossy textures, I found that putting the bump fairly high up seems to work really well. This may not work well for rocks and dirt, but it does kind of create a kind of a velvety feel for mosses and grasses, so I kind of like pushing that value a little higher. Over here on the actual principled BSDF, I'd recommend, if you don't have a roughness file, make sure your roughness is set to a fairly high level, because things like grass and moss and stuff are going to be, they're going to be rough. They're not going to be glossy. And you also want to change the specular value to either 0 or very close to 0, something very, very small. Again, otherwise it's going to be kind of washed out and glossy. You can see how it really washes out the color. So you can change this to something small, close to 0. Otherwise, it's going to reflect too much light back at you. Another thing I do to kind of mix things up, and the whole idea here is to try to get a series of textures that are just kind of built on top of each other, adding complexity and complexity and complexity to create kind of a natural environment. So another thing I do to create this is I create I take a noise texture just with a fairly high roughness value here, and then I put it through a color ramp to kind of crush the edges of it, and I use that as a factor in a mix node. So my my base diffuse color looks like this, but then I run it through an RGB curve node, dragging it down to make it darker, so it looks like that. And then when I mix them together, I get this nice mix of light and dark based on this kind of random global noise, right? It just adds some variety, and by using a color node versus just multiplying it by the color ramp, I think you preserve the colors better. And then that's the final result. You get kind of a very natural feel there. All right, so I'm going to go back up another layer, and we're at the layer where I'm mixing the near, medium, and far. I don't think there's too much to see here. You can certainly watch that guy's video on how to do that. And let's back up a little bit further. So now I'm at the highest level again of my my terrain texture. I've got this moss texture, and I have this other moss texture, and then I use the AO output, or the AO output file from Gaia, which looks like this, and then I run it through a color ramp just to kind of crush those together, and then I'm creating an even more complex version of my moss. So there's one moss, there's two moss, and then there's the combined moss. And I do something similar with my grassy meadow textures that I created, and these are all going to be the same kind of near far middle technique with the same kind of file setup that the first thing I showed you was. So here's my grass, here's my meadow, here's my noise, and then there's my combined grassy meadow texture. And then I use the grass output from Gaia, which is going to say where grass goes, run that through a color ramp to kind of tighten it up, and now I've got a complex grassy mossy texture that I can apply anywhere I want. And I do something similar with dirt. I've got dirt, another dirt, a little darker dirt, combine them together with noise. It gives me kind of this dirt look. And then I also do something similar with some rocks. I've got some different color rocks here, mossy rock, and then using the slope and texture-based outputs, I eventually get this kind of rocky, mossy looking base color. And then I use the soil and texture base out again, these are both from Gaia, to mix my dirt and my grassy bits together to finally form my final surface. All right, so that's the net effect of everything. And up here at the top, I'm using the river mask, and I've got a BSDF node that's my water. You could, of course, make this blue or green or whatever. I just wanted a kind of a dirty river, making sure that roughness is set to 0 because you want a glossy, and then your index or your specular value is fairly, it's not super high, but you don't want it to, you want it to be somewhat reflective. So, kind of adjust that to taste. And then these are just my settings for this. I create a little bit of a bump on it. I got a little bit of a noise texture on there just to create some textures to the surface. There's my river mask. And then that's just going to tell Blender where to put the water. And there we go. We got our river running through there. All right, next thing to do is talk about using the tree and scrub mask from Gaia to create vertex groups that can be used to distribute plants and trees across the landscape. So remember, the tree mask from Gaia looks like this. It's kind of this black and white image where we're going to put the trees. And we're going to use the vertex weight mix modifier to transform this black and white image into a vertex group, or a weight painted, paint the vertices here. So if we go into vertex groups, I'm going to create 2 more vertex groups. I'm just showing you how to create this modifier. So I'm going to call this one tree 0. And I'm going to call this one tree 1. And if I go into edit mode, I'm going to select everything, all these. I'm going to set the weight to 0, assign that to tree 0. And in tree 1, I'm going to set everything to 1 and assign that to 1. And then in here, I'm going to create a edit and then vertex weight mix. Here I'm going to choose tree 0 as the A group and tree 1 as the B group. And then down here, open up influence and then choose the tree mask. And if we go into weight paint mode, and then make sure we're choosing the 0 one, you can see that it's applied this to the vertex groups, but it's not using the right coordinate system. So go back to modifiers and change local to UV. All right, and that's all there is to creating a vertex group for out of the output mask. Let me get rid of this one. I don't need it. That was just for a demo. And you can see I've already created one for my trees and my scrubs. So if I go to here, 0 is my tree one, and then scrub is my scrub one. And then if I go back to object mode, and if I go to alpha trees, and let's say I turn on the Scots Pine, you can see that I got my camera clipping on, so it's only going to show up inside the camera. If you look in the camera, you can see it's only applying it to the areas where this mask tells it to put the trees. It's kind of cool. And if you don't apply these modifiers, and then if you go back into Gaia and you modify your masks in a way that would change where the trees are, the next time you open up Blender, it's going to automatically bring in those masks with the updates on them. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend applying these, especially if you think you're going to go back to Gaia and change stuff. All right, let's get rid of our trees. All right, the last thing to talk about is the environment and lighting. So I've got a sun lamp in here. These are my settings for that. This is just going to give me some nice controllable directional light, some kind of harsher, crisper outdoor shadows, which I kind of like. And then for overall lighting in the scene, I am using an HDRI. The shader editor, we'll go to world. And let's take a look at that. So that's what my HDRI looks like. It's got a nice horizon with clouds above it. And then if we go into camera view and take a look, you can see that the horizon line here, I've adjusted a little bit here with the Z for the mapping so that the horizon of this kind of base level clouds is below the horizon of my scene. That way the ambient lighting of my scene makes sense with the clouds, and it's just really cheap clouds that I can throw in there. I do have the mist pass turned on, and then in the compositor I have I also have the denoising on, so I've got the denoising data turned on, which gives me these nodes, which then I feed into this custom node that I created, this group that I've called mist. And in here, this is my mist setup. I've got the image coming in. I've got my mist kind of turned to a blue color, screening that, and then I add a little bit of defocus to it. It's going to create a kind of a blur at a distance in the image, and then I finally clean that up by running through the denoise. And then this is here just in case I want to modify the gamma. Right now I've just got it set to 1 by default. I'm just going to let you adjust the image, up or down one way or the other. So let's hit F12 and see what happens. All right, well there's the final render. We've got our fog and atmosphere in the background, trees and stuff, our river, our complex mosses and rocks growing out of our terrain. And then, of course, if you wanted to have an airplane or something fly through your terrain like that, there it is. So anyway, that's my Gaia to Blender workflow. Hopefully that was useful for you, and thanks for watching and good luck with your projects.